Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our May installation of the Global Online Seminar Series. This is actually our 32nd in the series, and we have the honor of Octavio Rojas, who is a researcher at the Instituto de Ecologia in Xalapa in eastern Mexico. Octavio did his all three of his degrees at UNAM in the Facultad de Ciencias. We were just talking about it being a 12-year punishment, but he survived, and in fact survived fairly well. So somehow or another he managed to get through 12 years at one institution with one advisor whom I won't name. Octavio is going to be talking about taxonomic units in ecological niche modeling. I want to take just a second to point out that he has quite deep roots in ecological niche modeling, which is to say his aunt was Margarita Soto and her husband Lauren Giddings, and the two of them, beginning in the late 1970s, were doing what were essentially proto-ecological niche models, and they published a pretty amazing series of papers in kind of a journal called Bioclimatology of Veracruz, of the vegetation of Veracruz. I'm messing up the title, but it basically suggests that Octavio has very, very deep roots in this field, and I'm sure his aunt and uncle are quite proud to see what he's doing with all of this. Octavio, thank you for taking the time to give the seminar. And audience, Octavio will put up links, email addresses and Twitter links for you to send comments and questions. And please send comments and questions during the seminar so that the questions are ready for Octavio at the end of the seminar. So Octavio, all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to you, Tom. I just want to thanks also the opportunity to share with you all these ideas, and also to give me the chance to share such ideas with this auditorium. Okay, so go ahead. I'm sharing the slides. Okay, hold on. I think I'm having some problems in sharing the slides. Okay.
There you go. I can
there we go. Thank you. Okay, let's start. This is the first slide when you can see the address where you can send the questions. Okay, let's begin. As Tom already told, the main aspect that I'm going to talk about is related with the taxonomic units in ecological niche modeling. The question is, do they matter? Okay, several aspects has been frequently highlighted within the ecological niche modeling. For instance, the use of layers and their spatial resolution, how many of them, for instance, what kind of algorithms could be the proper ones to develop or to solve the biological questions. What about the collinearity among localities, the importance of the extent of the study area, if we have absence, if we can use and how to use them, the importance of the prevalence, or also what about the thresholding when we have continuous outputs, or what kind of model validation we can use, and all the problems, for instance, when we do transferences, etc. However, there is a major issue that has been forgotten or maybe intentionally avoided due to its theoretical and empirical implications. We know that in correlative models, there are two sources of information, the environmental data and the species presence data. And also, if you have absences, if they exist. But the question that arises is, which is the criteria for choosing such localities records previous to modeling performance? Such criteria is the base in which we have to decide that a specific set of localities needs to be grouped to obtain a model. And hereafter is what I call the units in ecological niche modeling. In literature, it is common to find several kinds of units. When we apply exercise of modeling, for instance, species, subspecies, populations, municipalities, states, countries, ecosystems, genus, etc. Thus, I will focus on three major types of units that I have identified in literature. The most important is the taxonomical units, although those I'm going to talk about also about those based on political boundaries and other types of units such as the ecological ones. But this will take place at the end of this talk. Okay, we have to remember that in biology, units needs to be real entities. I mean, natural. If not, anything related with them will lack a reality or biological meaning. So the most important units that I'm to talk about is the taxonomic units, and I'm going to spend most of this talk talking about them. Okay, we know that most of us agree that species is the taxonomic unit accepted as the unit of evolution. It should be the best candidate to be used as the unit in ecological niche modeling. But this is another question that arises. What is a species? Okay, in some way, it is ironic that in the first page of the chapter 2, in the origin of the species, Charles Darwin wrote, "No one definition has as yet satisfied all naturalists. Yet every naturalist knows vaguely what he means when he speaks of a species." In a very general way, I'm going to talk about or I'm going to take a quick review of the most commonly used species concept. Okay, the typological species concept proposed by Linneo is just species. Species are defined as a group of individuals that share similar characteristics. But the limitation to these typological species concepts are that there is no relationship with the evolutionary theory. It establishes artificial limits to interspecific variation. It does not accept the existence of sibling species, although it is useful just when the individuals of the same species tends to be similar. Also, another concept that it is traditionally the most accepted and widely used concept around the world is the biological species concept. And it is defined as the group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups, according to Ernst Mayr. And however, there are several criticisms to this concept, albeit it is the most widely used. And I'm going to talk about some of them, just to highlight the most important under my view. For instance, this slide showed that one of the critics of this concept is that it is unidimensional in its space due to the individuals needs to be together to interbreed. It's what we call sympatry. So this figure pretends to illustrate some isolated populations, just an image. However, just to make my point. However, I want to talk about a particular and real case, which is the case of the Acorn woodpecker, which present populations in the continent, the mainland continent. And but there's also a small population isolated in the tip of Baja California's, in southern Baja California, in the Cape region. These isolated populations are supposed to interbreed with those from the continent based just on its similarity, albeit of its differences, such as the eyes coloration. I wonder if you can see that the one I'm talking about possess red eyes, and the rest population from the continent possessed white eyes. So this is just an example about how it's possible that this has highlighted population can interbreed with those from the continent. It sounds like impossible. Okay, another critique is that the concept is unidimensional in time due to the need to live in the same time to interbreed, what we call synchrony. So unless we assume the capability of interbreeding based on their dissimilarity, individuals from different epochs cannot be grouped within the same species. Okay, and what about, for instance, the fact that the biological species concept is applicable only with species with sexual reproduction? And my guess is that maybe no more than 40% of biodiversity presents this feature, this characteristic. Well, we know that even vertebrates present asexual or non-sexual reproduction. So I think we are now making this concept non-universal one. Okay, another problem, and a big problem, is that we have to remember that hybridization is a common phenomenon in many biological groups. And in the biological species concept, hybridization is synonymous of conspecificity. Well, because the biological species concept does not fit with the needs of paleontologists, Simpson defined species or proposed a new concept of species named the evolutionary species concept, and was defined as a lineage, an ancestral descendant sequence of population, evolving separately from others and with its own unitary evolutionary role and tendencies. Lately, Wiley presented a modification of these concepts, and he defined it as a single lineage of ancestral descendant population, which maintains its identity from other such lineages and which has its own evolutionary tendencies and historical fate. However, there are also critics to this concept because it results like as too theoretical and has a difficulty in the recognition of such lineages. Okay, so on the basis of the evolutionary species concept, Joel Cracraft proposed the phylogenetic species concept as the smallest diagnosable monophyletic group of population within which there is a parental pattern of ancestry and descent. Adding the fact that lineages can be recognized by diagnosable characters or autapomorphies or unique combination of characters, as has been proposed for other variations for the same concept, which I am not showing during this talk. Okay, but also as the other concepts, the the phylogenetic species concept also presents some critics. For instance, what level of divergence constitutes species? What is a diagnostic character? And what about the risk of wrong interpretation of plastic characters? So, well, although Sink has suggested the use of differentiation patterns instead of the quantity, I mean the level of divergence of differences. However, my opinion is that phylogenetic species concept is the one that better explains the process and patterns of organismic evolution. Although, again, I repeat, this is just my own opinion. However, I would like to talk about the unified species concept defined by Kevin Decairos, more or less recently, which suggested the unified species concept that can be achieved by the treating existence as a separately involving metapopulation lineage as the only necessary property of species, and the former secondary species criteria as different lines of evidence, which is an operational criteria, relevant to assessing lineage separation. Okay, so the idea, this idea might result as a conciliator among other concepts. For instance, although the unified species concept per se might not represent a different concept, this vision suggests that the use of different criteria can be applied at different evolutionary steps during the speciation process. However, still we have to decide in which step is the unit we want to model in order to select our set of localities. Okay, after this quick review of the theoretical concepts, now let's go into the empirical use of such concept in ecological niche modeling using diverse bird examples, since I am an ornithologist, or kind of. Okay, I'm comparing two basic ideas. The use of reproductive criteria, which is more related with biological species concept, versus the use of lineages criteria, which is more related with evolutionary or phylogenetic species concepts. Okay, so let's begin with this example. You guys know that I am really love with this bird, although it's a little bit ugly, but sounds very beautiful. I don't know, for some reasons, I've been studying this bird for maybe the last 20 years. And it's an example that I know very well to make my point. Okay, let's see. In long time ago, I studied its geographic variation on this complex. That's what I call him as a complex, the curvil thrasher complex. Well, in this slide, you can see that its geographical distribution includes mainly the Sonora and Chihuahua desert and adjacent areas, and Oaxaca's central valley. Based on the reproductive criteria, the curvil thrasher complex is recognized as a single biological species and is divided in 7 subspecies. Okay, however, based on my own research on morphology and colorimetry, I found no correspondence with the 7 described subspecies. As you can see in this slide, the tree does not fit with any of the groups expected based on subspecies. So even though I use the same characters used for the description of each of the subspecies. Okay, so now let's back to ecological niche modeling for an instance. For instance, what if I choose just the localities from the subspecies Toxostoma curvirastre oberholseri? You can see in this slide, this is the bunch of occurrences known for the whole complex. And in the green polygon is represented, in theory, the distribution of these subspecies. So let's take a quick look. If we select those localities to represent the environmental habitat or kind of environmental niche where the species lives. In the next slide, we can see that the characterization of the environment used by the species will not cover by an artificial grouping, named in this case the subspecies oberholseri. Okay. However, based on morphology and colorimetry, the same results, we can see that I observed 2 major groups. One related with the Sonoran Desert and the other one with the Chihuahua and adjacent areas. Okay, besides using mitochondrial DNA analysis, it was revealed only 2, well, maybe 3 groupings, as can be seen in this slide. But again, think that I'm using morphological and genetic characters to try to find out which are the evolutive units within this complex. So thus, on the phylogenetic species concept, we can identify 2, again, or maybe 3 major clades, represented by the Sonora and the Pacific Plain coast, the second clade by the Chihuahuan Desert and adjacent areas, and finally the third clade represented in southern Puebla and central valleys of Oaxaca. Okay, now based on lineage criteria, can you see the differences in this slide? I wonder if you, but I do. Okay, well, under your opinion, what would be the proper unit for modeling? I mean, if we can compare the two images within this slide, we can see the whole complex represented by the sum of all subspecies as one unit. You can see a single of the subspecies as a unit, or you can see in the other map the proposed lineages. So, under my point of view, the artificiality of subspecies based on biological species concept are obscuring the real patterns of differentiation. But I have another example, very interesting example because the implication in conservation. This is related with the California gnatcatcher. And well, I don't wonder if you know that this group possesses an endangered species within the US and in the Californian coastlands, which you know that probably are the most expensive around the world. Well, the problem with this subspecies recognized by the US government is that there is another subspecies described for the rest of Baja California Peninsula. But as you can see, there are several but undefined subspecies. I mean, there are several proposals that has described in each case different units. So, for instance, focus on the woody subspecies described in the third map on your right. It's funny, but the authors define the limits of the subspecies distribution just in the US and Mexican border. So it's funny, but when the birds fly through the border, it did not just change its risk status, it changed its taxonomical recognition. So it's funny, maybe this is one of the reasons why Donald Trump wants to justify the building of the wall, but I mean, to avoid Mexican subspecies to fly through. But although, of course, this is a joke, I think that the conservation and biographical implications is quite serious. Okay, however, genetic analysis talking about this complex, well, actually it's not this complex, it's just a single species, because the genetic analysis demonstrate that this is only a single lineages. So can you imagine the risk in choosing a wrong taxonomic criteria for modeling? And I have another several species. For instance, Bob Sink wrote a paper named The Role of Subspecies in Obscuring Avian Biological Diversity and Misleading Conservation Policy. Well, if you read this paper, you will find out very interesting points. For instance, using mitochondrial DNA, they discovered that there is no correspondence between the genetic groups obtained in relation to the described subspecies. Actually, of 43 species, only 3% of the subspecies do coincide with evolutionary entities, as can be shown in this slide, the list of another examples about the artificiality of subspecies. Okay, within this paper, I found this subtitle named, that says, "Are subspecies bad, or are there just bad subspecies?" Okay, based on the number of groups of monophyletic haplotypes, there is an average of 1.9 independent evolutionary groups within recognized biological species. That is, the number of real entities is much larger and is not represented through the use of subspecies. So I can say now that subspecies are bad, although there are some good subspecies, but under my point of view, should be named as species. Okay, you may say too much taxonomy, but not modeling at all. And okay, let's go. Let's go to an ecological niche modeling example, which is a study that I work with another of my colleagues. And this is about the analysis of ecological niche modeling units using the genus Dendroptyx, which is a genus endemic to Mesoamerican region. It possesses officially under biological species concept 3 species, Dendroptyx macroura, barbatus, and leucophis. And within Macroura and Leucophis, there are also divisions in subspecies. Okay, except by Dendroctis barbatus, which possess known subspecies. Okay, these polygons represent the 3 tested taxonomic categories. What we have done is model it just to show the different results, or to find out what about if we model the genus, the species, or the subspecies. We use the whole occurrences of the genus, as you can see in the first image. In the second one, use the 3 different species, recognized species, without consideration of subspecies. And in the third exercise, we model actually the subspecies, in this case in Macroura, which we model 5, although there is a 6th subspecies, but actually, I want to be honest, we were not able to distinguish it because mostly of the localities were mixed up. So we've modeled just finally 5 subspecies within this species. And the third, another third exercise was related with the subspecies of Dendroctis leucophis. Again, I want to be honest, we were not able to distinguish among the 2 subspecies described by Chiapas, Guatemala, and Honduras, because the 2 subspecies are just mixed up. Okay, let's see the results. These are the geographic models obtained for each category. As you can see, the genus to your left, the species. You can see. Well, I know this is a very small picture, but I want to see you just the patterns. And as you can notice, you zoom the species maps. You didn't obtain the genus. Looks like if you model the genus, you find models that are well, you find more over prediction. And now focus on the Dendroctis macroura. When we model the 5 subspecies, again we realized that we cannot obtain what we obtain using just the species macroura. And the same thing happened with Dendroctis leucophis in the low figures in this slide. So the sum of maps of the same category did not recover the map of the upper category. Okay, well, at the species, complex level, we did not recover the genus level, neither geographically nor ecologically. You can see some spaces that are not covered by the complexes that are covered using the genus, particularly within this ecological space. Okay, in this example, at the subspecies level, we did not recover the species level, neither geographically nor ecologically. And again, there is actually the areas recovered by the species are not recovered by the sum of the subspecies, as it's more clearly shown in the ecological space. And that this last example, the subspecies level, using leucophis in this time, we didn't recover again the species level neither geographically nor ecologically. Okay, in all cases, we obtain different geographic and ecological patterns. Okay, let's take this a quick look at this last example. Here we model 2 lineages instead of 3 subspecies, although 1 subspecies actually correspond with 1 lineage. In this case, the subspecies Hypospodius presented in red. Okay, so the subspecies of Dendroctis leucophis display morphological differences that correspond to the group separated by the Nicaraguan Depression. This could represent a biogeographic barrier that could promote the differentiation between both lineages. And you can see that the morphological differentiation actually tends to be clear. Okay, on this last example, used as a corollary, I want to point out the importance of our decision in distinguishing what we should model. The biological species concept, based on a reproductive community, or a single one of the lineages identified by morphology and DNA in the case of the emerald toucanet complex. In this case, I'm showing just those populations, differentiated populations in Mexico, although we know that these complexes go further to Central and Southern America. But clearly there are three different lineages and isolated, I mean. Okay, I'm finished with the taxonomical units. I hope I hope that I made my point. I hope that you can see that the moral of the story is not to use a specific species concept. Well, I can have my own opinion about it. However, my suggestion, the moral of the story again, is that we have to be worried about the taxonomy prior to the modeling exercises. For instance, and after that, I want to talk about another two kind of units. In the first case, I'm going to talk about just a little bit, but it's important that to highlight the fact that sometimes, and it's very frequently, the use of politic as boundaries. Under my point of view, it is not recommended, although in literature it's quite common to find this kind of units. For instance, what if we choose just the localities from the state of Sonora as an example? Again, there is a lack of good representation of the environments used by the species under the biological species concept, as you can see represented in this slide. Or the same thing that the previous slide, but now using a country. What about, for instance, if we choose just the localities from Mexico in the case of the curvirastre? Again, note that the lack of representation, at least in this slide, in colder and drier climates. Okay. Well, this is just something that I described briefly. However, I want to point out another types of unit, such as the ecological ones. In this case, these units are represented by ecosystems. Just only with the intention of describe another strategy that has been used as units of modeling, I want to show a couple of relatively recent studies that use ecosystems directly as the unit of modeling. For instance, I want you to focus on the methods. I highlight the methods that these authors use, and they describe just like that. We obtain a map of presented cloud forest distribution from the Mexican government and converted this into 1 kilometer presence-absent grid for analysis. We randomly selected 1,370 grid cells, square root of the root sense, to use a presence point to train the model and generate 3,000 background points across Mexico. Okay, what the researchers done is just select a polygon and choose randomly points within this polygon that it's already identified as a cloud forest in this case, and they make the models. And they transfer them into the future climate scenarios. Okay, well, actually, there's almost the same authors recently published another paper when they again use the same approxy. As you can see, again, to model the current extent of each ecosystem, random points across each ecosystem were selected to cover the full range of the existing altitudes and plant covers. Okay, this is another example of the same methodology. Okay, as an alternative, we have modeled the ecosystem. Well, we have the same goal, but in this case, we have used an ontological niche approach. This is by model restricted species at some degrees to each ecosystem, and then reconstruct the ecosystem. In this first slide, I want to show that just the results that we obtain by zoom different models of individual species, and actually we recover the ecosystem. Well, this is maybe another theme for another talk, but I want to point out just that the use of such units defined just by randomly points within an ecosystem might be difficult to understand, particularly when we know that the niche is related with the species. I mean, if the species exists, the niche exists. So this relationship, to me, it's hard to understand how we can use artificially or randomly localities from an ecosystem, but also please remind that you have to be sure that the ecosystem is already defined. Okay, well, I think under my point of view, I am done. So thanks a lot. I am ready to hear your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Octavio.
Oh, you're welcome, Tom.
Let me see if we have questions for you.
Okay.
And oh, I guess I'll throw a question at you if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
What do you feel if we're setting out to reconstruct the fullest picture of the fundamental niche of the species? So we're wanting to characterize the species' response to the driest and the wettest and the warmest and the coldest conditions. Wouldn't that argue for creating models at a relatively broad taxonomic scope rather than narrow? Which is to say, can that give us some guidance about at what level we should be working?
This is quite interesting questions. And I think that the answer is quite complex too. But let me think.
Take your time.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm just trying to figure out the best way to reconstruct the fundamental niche. And sometimes one of the lacks of the correlative models is that we use just occurrences in combination with environmental layers, and we know that that we are not obtaining the fundamental niche. But my guess is if we use other species, close related species to the one we are focusing, I'm not necessarily sure that we are cover another environment within the niche, because it depends on the evolution on each of the species. I remember at this time, for instance, an example when a spider, which there were two well-defined species isolated each other morphologically. However, after they found that there's a third more related species that was adapted to live in a cave within one of these mountains. So I'm using this example just to show that the evolution of each of the clades we might to figure out about the niche of the niche might be quite different. Some of them might occupy the whole, for example, the whole niche, but some others might be restricted, maybe because the presence of competitors, maybe because they haven't access to other areas that can be used by the species, but they cannot reach them. So within this scenario, to me, it's hard to give you a clear response to your question, although it's interesting. I'm not positive if we can think that we can recover the whole picture using correlative models. Although, again, I think that the use of well and clearly defined evolutive units as the ecological unit I think it should be works much better than for instance, another different unit based on, I don't know, reproduction or whatever. So I don't know if I get close to your question. I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have discussed this a bunch of times. I just, I just wonder if the best approach. I mean, your points are very well taken that it matters, and I'm just wondering if the best approach wouldn't be to define the taxonomic units at the finest scale that the phylogenetic results permit, which is to say down to evolutionary species.
Yes.
And test for significance of differentiation, which is to say something akin to a background similarity test where you would reject the hypothesis of similarity of niches.
Mm-hmm.
If you fail to reject similarity, then I would think that the best thing to do to reconstruct more of the species response would then be to start to lump the evolutionary taxa, just as units of analysis, essentially out to the coarsest unit that is still significantly or not significantly different.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, but can you see the particular question, the biological question you already have is very specific, and also, well, you talk about one example when the populations can be recognized as to be similar. But there are other examples, or would be another examples, where you can actually accept or deny the such hypothesis. So I think that, well, you can model whatever you want as long as you can justify. What I'm saying is, in general, when we talk about biogeography, when we talk about conservation or such relation questions, again, for me, the best unit to model is the species, actually the phylogenetic species. But again, I think you are thinking more in a fundamental niche, and this maybe this you can try for another kind of units. But I want to highlight something. You're clear that you are exploring the smallest units, and you, in your example, you are not getting results, so you intentionally are moving up, and that's okay. But you're clear what you're doing, and that maybe that's the moral of the story, that you have to be clear within this evolutive process. That I think.
Okay. I'll certainly buy that answer. I like that, because too often you read a methods section of a paper and it's just given without, the taxonomic level is given and there's no thought about it and there's no discussion or justification.
Yeah.
So we actually just got a question in from the Netherlands, from Mirsa. And Mirsa is asking, how justified is it to use niche modeling or distribution modeling as a supporting argument for delineating a subspecies? So in addition to using morphological or genetic differences between populations that would make them worthy of being a separate subspecies, what do you think about using niche differences of populations to identify them as separate taxonomic units? And is there some research already done on this?
Okay, this is another very interesting question. As you know, what I've done is describe the process from the units to the units of evolution, from taxonomy to the ecological niche modeling field. However, this question is related on how we use, what about if we use the opposite way, if we can use the ecological niche modeling to define such units. Well, there are several studies that we have learned something about them. The idea is that once you identify an isolated population, which maybe that could be the same or the first step, once you define an isolated population, and once you realize that there are morphological genetic differences, you can also, I mean, you can, with some confidence, you can take such occurrences and model them as a unit, and then compare with other units. And in this case, you can realize that maybe the environment used by these different populations are actually also different. Okay, this is one point. Another point is that maybe, and I am not saying that these are rules. I mean, I am just thinking on how we can do some approximations. For instance, what about if we just put all together all the occurrence within a complex? Let's remember the one I discussed about, which is the curvirastre complex. Can you remember how widely distributed is the complex? So imagine that you take all these occurrences and you made a statistical analysis using environment or climate information. And for instance, I'm thinking in maybe principal component analysis or whatever ordination analysis we can, and we can maybe identify that some of the groups of occurrences or some of occurrences from groups, ecological groups. And actually, I am doing an exercise like that, and we suddenly discovered that it is possible to obtain. Sorry. Was my boss? Well, I have to hang up.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's better to.
Yeah. So I wonder if I am explaining myself. You can go in both directions. For me, the most important is that you are that you know what are you doing, and if you want to use environmental or ecological niche modeling to support the existence of a grouping, that's okay. I mean, there are several examples that have shown this as a possibility. And I don't want to deny the opposite direction. To me, it's just fine as long as we know what we are doing.
Sounds good to me. I think I'm seeing no further questions. Have one question here in the room with me from Daniel Jimenez from Puebla.
Yeah, Octavio.
Okay.
And I have a question about the change of the biogeographic point about if we remove these subspecies. What do you think about the political cost about this?
That's very interesting, but also a funny question. When I say funny, I said it because we wrote a paper some few years ago. Then when we pretend, when we compare the two endangered species list, the bird Mexican species list, and our point was to show what happened, because we know that the Mexican endangered species list is based on biological species concept, which includes the use of subspecies. But you know, we make this exercise guessing if we use the phylogenetic species concept, what would be the shape of this list, and when we compare what we gained or lost during the exercise. And the most funny situation was that actually we realized that we are protecting 43 ghost subspecies. And when I say ghost, I mean non-existent groups, real entities. So we are just I can say we're preserving names that are not without evidence of morphological, neither ecological, neither genetic evidence. And well, this is one example. Another one is we found that there is maybe 60, 70 correspondence among both concepts. I mean, under both concepts, we recognize the same groups, but the other 40%, it's what is the problem. If you ask me my opinion, I think that the world would benefit if we removed subspecies from the taxonomy, and I think that the political consequences will be that we're going to get closer to protect and to understand the biodiversity patterns much more better than the using subspecies. And please let me talk quickly about this example. Some figures a few years ago, we decided well, we have the chance to travel to the Tiburon Island, which is the biggest island in Mexico. And we went there because there has been described 7 subspecies endemic to the island, bird endemic subspecies. So we went there, we collect some samples, and using samples from the continent, we analyze genetically, but also we use an ecological niche modeling to see if the subspecies from the island show at least any degree of differentiation, including genetic and ecological differentiation. And what we realized that is that among the 7 subspecies, just 1 subspecies, which is the Pipilo fuscus, well, I think it has been changed to Melosone fusca, I guess, I can't remember now. But the
Octavio.
Yeah.
Yes?
You're getting old.
Yeah, I'm getting old. No, well, I'm getting old too. But the taxonomy also is changing too fast. I don't want. I don't want to learn more names because the next month they will change. So anyway, this population is the only that could be justified the recognition of a different evolutive unit, but the rest of the 6 are not supported at all. And the most funny is that also species are protected. So again, we are protecting ghosts just because we are using subspecies. That's my point.
Questions keep coming. Ben Freeman, who's one of my students.
Yeah, hello, this is Ben. Thank you for the presentation. I think my question is very basic, just related to what you just talked about.
Okay.
So the idea about the species complex, I think you don't support subspecies, which me too, I think I have problem with. But then what do you think, is it getting rid of, considering the entire complex as one species, is that what you support, or like go into detail, and if those species need to be split, you just split them and consider that individual species? Because from the conservation perspective, I think if we are not, I mean, if you have a complex of species, one species might be very obvious, and if you want to do any modeling, you might have more data than the other species, so you might be like carried away by that information. So I'm a little bit worried about that.
Okay, let's see if through my answer I understand you. When we talk about complexes, we are talking about groups that are not well defined taxonomically. So once we go in a deeper detail, as you mentioned, it's that in theory what we're supposed to do as a biologist. Sometimes we have not the chance to study all the groups with frequency we see in literature. These trees but lacking a lot of samples from different species. So we have an idea. However, I know that there are several groups, even in birds, that is probably the most studied group in the world. We have several groups that we have no these details within the taxonomy. So if you don't have information, you can work with the complex, and that's okay, as long as you recognize within your study that maybe there's a lack of information, evolutionary information, with lacking within the study, and you are taking conclusions based on that. But if you already have evidence, I don't know if it's morphological, genetic, environmental, whatever kind of evidence you can use for justify the use of 1 or 2 units of different units, I mean, that's the best way we have, we should do. What I'm saying is that we have to live with the lackings we have, particularly in taxonomy, and particularly because each time is hard to get well results when you send, for instance, a paper to get published. And if you don't have a bunch of information, probably this paper will be denied or refused. However, I was just thinking in the unified species concept that I'd like to talk briefly during my talk. I think as long as you can put together the most a bunch of evidence, you can get better prediction. But if you don't have them, and if you have to work with a complex that hasn't been studied, I mean, that's a problem, but that's okay. I mean, it's better than nothing, as long as you, again, recognize that you live in a non-solved world, non-well understood world.
Okay. Well, Octavio, thanks very much. Very much appreciate your time and your thinking. I'm sorry there's no applause when you give online seminars, but you're certainly deserving of it. For the broader audience, please join us again on June 7th, where we'll have the 33rd in this series, and it's a presentation on null biogeographic testing for assessing ecological niche evolution. And Laura Nunez will give that talk. So please join us in a month and a little bit. And for now, Octavio, thanks very much.
Thanks to you, and thanks for everybody.
All the best. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.